Welcome. My goal today is to introduce you to some Spartan strategies for success in the RTP process. I think often RTP feels like a process that is beyond our control, that exists outside of us, and in which we may feel we have very little agency. Part of my job is to help you feel the agency a little bit more in this process so that you come into it feeling like it's productive, meaningful, and dare I say, empowering. Okay? Now, my name's Deanna Fassett. I'm the director of your Center for Faculty Development. I think that's a distinction that matters. We're not just a center for faculty development. We are your center, and I'm happy to develop content that you need. Okay? Before that, though, I was a department chair, and I did that for almost 6 years. And before that, I was a faculty member here at San Jose State, navigating the review, tenure, and promotion process. Back then, we didn't have e-faculty. We had to do it old-timey scrapbook style, and this gives you a sense of all of the labor that you are doing. I know you're feeling it day to day, but there is something very different about aggregating it and putting it in one spot and seeing it there and saying to yourself, wow, that's more work than the height of a highlighter, right? You could see I was really feeling the effort that went in to this process. Now all of that, though, is behind and inside e-faculty. And in some senses, all of that labor that's feeling very real to you, doesn't stop feeling real to you, is somewhat hidden. And part of what I want to talk to you about today is how to feel seen in the RTP process, okay? And how to be recognized for the good work that you're doing. I also want the documentation of your good work to not be an impediment to your good work. Does that make sense? Right? Okay. So I tried to organize my talking points into what I hope will be a memorable acronym. Spartan, right? The purpose here is to become a somewhat permanent Spartan, right? And so we'll kind of step through these one by one. But the first is about synergies. It is never too soon for you to open up the RTP policy, to review what it says in terms of how you will be evaluated. It is never too soon for you to look at college or departmental RTP guidelines, or to talk with your colleagues about what is customary, routine, and valued in your department, your discipline, your college, and here at San Jose State. When I say synergy, I'm referring to the ways in which your research makes you a more effective teacher and a more engaged teacher, more motivated to dive into student success, for example. I'm interested in how teaching informs the choice of what you write or perform or photograph or develop. Okay? And I'm interested in how your leadership and your service intersects with your teaching and your research, your scholarship, and your creative activity. Those synergies are really significant to your long-term survival navigating your career as a scholar. Right? Ideally, we are not living divided lives where we feel like our scholarship and our teaching and our service are somehow antithetically opposed to one another. What I hope we can do in the RTP process is articulate and then therefore better choose opportunities for ourselves that cross-pollinate, that help strengthen you as a whole person rather than dividing you into pieces. Articulating these synergies help you make a persuasive case in the RTP process. Sometimes when I meet with faculty for individual consultations, what I find them doing is simply listing stuff, documenting stuff for sure, but it's not necessarily compelling. They're not making a case. They're not seeing it as an organizing narrative about who they are, and they're naming the data points that are visible in e-faculty, but not the connective tissue that makes them make sense to you, to others, to people beyond your department or your college. It's also important, I think, to consider a few other P words. So I cheated with this particular piece of the acronym. I tossed in positive because I think it's important to remember that being defensive is not going to be a helpful way forward. A confident case, a compelling case, is positive. It establishes goals for yourself. It shows where you have met those goals and where you still have work to do. But it's not reactive or defensive or angry and we can talk about what all of those things might be. I mentioned policy already. We could have put policy here. I think having the policy next to you while you're working on your materials can be really useful. It will help you think about language from the policy that can inform and strengthen the argument that you're making about yourself and where you fit with respect to the things that your university values, right? And then the third P that I was thinking about, and again, decided I'd cheat and just say it here, is planning. A compelling case is planned, right? It's not done in the last few days before the materials are due. Having said that, you know, that's we're here to talk about best practices, right? The best practice is to plan in advance, and even your first mini review is a great place to begin thinking about your case, your narrative, and how you want to be seen in this process, how to be positively memorable. But planning requires you to get a head start, and I think that one thing that you can do is, even though you're doing your mini review right now and your annual summary of achievements right now, your dossier isn't far behind. Okay, so use this as the occasion to begin to build your knowledge, build your skills, build your narrative, so that whenever you get to August or when you're working over the summer, it's not such a shock, right? Okay. Next up. Oh. So I think that requires some attention to your audience. Now, I showed you very early on the slide of my dossier, and it's all its glory. It's resplendent glory, okay? And yours will also be glorious, but inside eFaculty. But what that doesn't show is what happens next, right? It's not just you who serves as the primary audience of your dossier or your annual summary of achievements. You have initially an audience who's very close to you, colleagues in your department, whom your department has elected to serve in that personnel capacity. Your department chair will provide input on your case, right? But at higher and higher levels of review, more and more different kinds of people will be looking at your materials, whether, you know, and again, that varies from one evaluation level to another. An ASA is evaluated differently than a dossier. Nevertheless, I think it's important to remember that you have to contextualize matters that may be obvious to you or to people in your discipline or your department that are not at all obvious to people outside. If you can imagine that binder or the case in eFaculty amplified out by a college looking at 15 or 20 or more cases, at the university level looking at still more cases, it's important to know that if you are an Elizabethan poet, you may need a scientist to look at your materials. If you're a chemist, you may need the poet, right? Just so that you're sure that you're making your best possible case. And this is where it can help to share your materials with a trusted colleague, whether that's across the country or it's on campus. I think someone who is familiar with San Jose State norms, with our policy and with our customs, would be a really important person to consult with. And remember always that the Center for Faculty Development provides individual consultation and confidential consultation on your ASA, on your dossier, on your CV, and anything else you might like to share. Okay. Given that you have different people at different stages and different levels of expertise looking at your materials, it's also important to remove as many unnecessary frictions as you can from that process. eFaculty is a platform. It is a work in progress, and it means that it doesn't always do everything the way we expect it will. It won't necessarily operate like Facebook. It won't necessarily be as easy to use as some other system, but it does behave consistently. And I think it's important to know that anything you can do digitally to make your materials accessible to lots of different people who may be downloading each of those files individually, the better. And this can mean paying attention to the look and feel of your materials. That might be something like a table that compares your SOTs, right, and shows the data points across a given course or semester or trajectory. It could look like taking all of your front matter and rendering it into a single scrollable PDF, so it's really easy for committee members to take a look at what's there without having to look at 10 different individual files. It could look like having a single naming convention for your files, so that your files aren't WTF CV version 13 or something like that, right? Ideally, it might be your last name, the name of the document, and the semester, or something like that, right? But remember, other people will see your file names, or may see your file names, and you want those to be ready for prime time. Another important point along that is having consistency across different documents. A great example of this is if you indicate something to be peer-reviewed in one part of your material, say your ASA, but you don't seem to signal it's peer-reviewed on your CV or vice versa, that's a kind of unnecessary friction. You don't really want a committee member starting to call your credibility into question as to whether that particular writing was indeed peer-reviewed or not, right? So remove those unnecessary frictions. It can help you to have a system to track. In an ideal world, you would love eFaculty so ardently that you would put every little thing in there from the very beginning. And props to you if you were doing that. I love that. But, you know, the semester is busy, your lives are hectic, and it may be that you want to go into eFaculty and add materials in at intervals that make sense to you. The end of the semester, for example, okay? Where that's the case, I think you need a tracking system. You need to know for yourself when you're going to go ahead and put materials in. You're going to want to make sure that you have a file in your email system or in your Dropbox folder or wherever you, whichever way you prefer to store your files, where you capture anything to do with RTP and you hold it there so that you're not chasing down things at the last minute, which can really amplify your stress and interfere with your ability to really think through the more higher level considerations of your tenure case. I think also it's just a good reminder that if you are involved in service activities, leadership roles, especially ones where you have a heavy lifting role, don't wait until it's important, till it quote unquote important, year 3, for example, when you get a letter from someone documenting your heavy lifting role. Get that as you go, right? Hold on to that stuff. People retire, people change occupations, things happen. And what you don't want to do is have a kind of, oh, I don't know, a fractured support where you had some really important work that you did and the right person to evaluate it may no longer be available to evaluate you. Don't wait. Don't delay. Act now. Okay. So then it can be helpful to remember, after all of this and everything from the conceptual to the nitty-gritty, that being adaptive is one of the most important things that you can have. A growth mindset here is very important. You are learning as you go. You're strengthening your skills as you go. And that goes for everything from how you are retaining and capturing your documentation all the way out to, you know, the kind of feedback you're receiving from the department or from the college, from the dean, from the university. You want to adapt in relation to that feedback. You are putting a lot of time and effort and energy into this process. And so are your colleagues at every level of this university. That's not time lost. unless you fail to make any of the adaptations, recommendations, or directions for growth that people have suggested to you, right? So this is an important way to get news you can use. You can then show your growth, learn all you can, and, you know, again, going back to the nitty-gritty, that flexibility really helps, right? Sometimes you're going to get an instruction at the last minute about something to do with e-faculty that is going to be beyond the control of university personnel and faculty affairs. And you just got to say, well, okay, that's rough, and maybe have some gallows humor about it, and know that there is collective goodwill and grace. Let someone know how you're feeling about it, for sure. But I think your flexibility, your early preparedness, your care and regard, and your desire to get the most meaningful feedback you can get is really critical to this process. So then I cheated again with the last one. It's like, I don't know what I should say. There were so many words that begin with N that I thought would work. And I'm going to share a few of them here just by way of closure. We could talk about noteworthy. Noteworthy was the first thing I thought of. Make sure that the things you put in your materials are truly noteworthy accomplishments. It avoids the kind of accusation that you're padding. You're stuffing things in there just to kind of kill your committee with paper. It's not really paper anymore, but you get the idea. So noteworthy accomplishments, remembering, of course, that some of you will have the tendency to undersell those accomplishments. And that's why you need someone else maybe in your world to say, hey, wait a minute, that's actually a bigger deal than you're making it out to be, right? Another one I thought of was no nonsense, right? No nonsense. Don't get embroiled in drama with this. Be very practical. Get what you can get from it and really allow it to inform you. Make it a purposeful, meaningful process. At every level, you can control that for yourself. And I put next up here because I was thinking really what's important here is always knowing what's coming next. I want you to always be aware of what's next available to you. What is the next evaluation cycle? What is the next level of review? What is the next promotion you're seeking? Right? What is the next publication in your pipeline? All of those nexts are very important to your success in terms of pursuing and achieving tenure. And the last N word I was thinking of was narrative. You know, you have control over your narrative. And that's what this is about, is how to best frame that for your colleagues, both in your department and beyond.